Chapter 40, Infiltration PT2. Ruby's first reaction was to immediately start struggling, trying to pry the hand away from her throat. She was surprised when the knife sunk into her stomach and two hands grabbed her shoulders, flipping her around and slamming her head into the table again. Cold steel snapped into place around her wrists, her hands now handcuffed behind her. Realizing that starting an all-out fight was probably a bad decision in the middle of a small town, Ruby tamped down her raging aura, going limp, the hands still holding her down. "Wait," she gasped, coughing out a little blood. "I won't hurt you, promise." "The fuck?" the voice said. "I'm not scared of you hurting me, but why aren't you dead yet?" Ruby said. "Could you not shout? I'm trying to avoid being detected." The pressure on her back lifted, and Ruby slowly turned herself around, seeing a shadowy figure back away from her, grabbing a lantern and switching it on, setting it down on the table next to a folder of documents. Ruby blinked a little, her eyes adjusting to the sudden light. A rabbit fauna stood in front of her, with deep blue hair and scarlet eyes. She was quite a bit taller than Ruby, wearing a fluffy white nightrobe and slippers. Her youthful appearance belied her world-weary eyes that were full of mistrust and suspicion. Her hair was let down, the shimmers of blue cascading below her shoulders. "What are you doing in my house?" she demanded, going to the kitchen counter and pulling out another knife. "I'm going to stab you again if you try to lie to me." Ruby thought for a second, not really wanting to be stabbed. "Do you know anyone named Mark?" she finally said. "What? Never heard of him," and that wasn't an answer, the rabbit said, walking towards her. "Okay, wait, Ruby said, panicking a little. "I just wanted to see what was behind these walls, and whether or not I could get into contact with Mark." The rabbit fauna stopped. "Are you the new arrival? The one that's supposed to be staying outside of New Haven?" "New Haven?" Ruby asked incredulously. "That's this town's name." The rabbit grimaced. Yeah, I didn't make that decision. And anyways, we're getting off topic." She noticed the knife sticking out of Ruby's stomach, blood dripping down her leg and pooling on the tiled floor. "Let me remove the knife so you stop bleeding all over my kitchen," she said, walking towards Ruby and pulling the knife out. "Isn't this where you ask me if I'm okay?" Ruby said, frowning a little. "And do you mind wrapping something over it? I'm bleeding even more now." The blood flow had increased after the knife had been taken out, and Ruby had her hands bound behind her. The rabbit moved to a cabinet, opening it up and rummaging through it. "I heard you were a monster," she said. "Rumors have been spreading, and I don't know how true they are, but you seem to be dealing just fine with a stab wound." Pulling out a pristine white towel, she looked at it for a second and put it back, eventually finding a rag of cloth. "So, what's your name?" Ruby asked as the rabbit tied the rag around her midsection, stemming the blood flow and keeping her insides in place. "Call me Maya," she said, stepping back and taking a good look at Ruby. "You don't look like a monster," Maya said curiously. "Thanks, I guess," Ruby said, glad that Maya wasn't calling for help. "And why are you wearing so little?" Maya asked. "I'm pretty sure those rolls of steel silk are the only things holding your dress together." Ruby blushed, realizing how tattered she looked. "Combat skirt," Ruby said, correcting her. "And I haven't had any need for clothing. The cold doesn't really affect me much, and these clothes have a sentimental value." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Back to the topic. Why shouldn't I just arrest you right now and put you into prison?" "You can arrest me?" Ruby asked. Maya nodded. "I'm a police officer. Where do you think I got those handcuffs from? Now answer the question." "Well, I haven't hurt anyone," Ruby offered. "Aha," Maya said, unconvinced. "And so you sneaked into my house because I wanted someone to talk to." "This conversation is useless," Maya said, frowning. "I'm going to bring you in, and then the council can make a decision." Ruby looked around desperately, growing alarmed. But you can't," she said, trying to balance herself with her arms behind her back. "Then they won't let me live here." "Not my problem," Maya said, walking towards her. "I have bigger issues to deal with." Seeing that she had no choice, Ruby flared her aura, tugging her wrists apart, her bones bruising and cracking a little, the metal groaning, and she snapped the handcuffs in half, two metal bracelets around her wrists. Maya backed away, startled. What the foo? Ruby blinked forward in a swirl of rose petals, slamming a fist into her stomach and smashing a palm into her temple, dropping her to the floor. Maya was now slumped sideways on the ground, her robe spread to the side, giving Ruby a nice view of her long legs and shapely bottom. After a few seconds, Ruby managed to pull herself away from the sight and tell herself to think, wondering what she could do now. Killing the faunus would raise too much suspicion, Ruby decided, crouching down and stroking Maya's legs, the smooth skin like silk underneath her fingers. Especially because she was a policewoman. Ruby stood up, walking toward the lantern that was illuminating the room. Remembering the pile of documents beside it, she sifted through them, opening them up and skimming them quickly, knowing that Maya would probably come to in a minute or so. She hadn't hit her that hard, and she had her sturdy faunus constitution. The documents seemed to contain information on cases, with names and times and places highlighted, a few things marked, important, or, keep away from sheriff, so she took the entire folder, pulling a few towels out of the closet and wrapping the folder up, typing it to her shoulder. Maya was stirring, so Ruby crouched next to her, shaking her. Maya's eyes blinked wide open, staring at Ruby. Wah. Shish, Ruby said, placing a finger over her lips. I took the documents in your table. Her hunch that the documents were important was confirmed when Maya immediately tried to stand up, her motor skills not yet fully recovered after the knockout. Wait, she pleaded. Don't take those. Sorry, but I'll give them back when I know you won't report me, Ruby said, standing up. And I probably won't be coming back for a while, so don't even think about trying to set me up. Typing a long ribbon of steel silk to the end of her scythe, Ruby stepped out of the window and jumped to the roof, Maya still trying to get up. Swinging her scythe on the end of the ribbon, Ruby threw it upwards in an arc, embedding it into the side of the wall. She immediately jumped up and began climbing, pulling herself up using the ribbon. She quickly made her way to the top, not looking behind her. Running across the walkway, she didn't even bother to anchor her scythe before jumping down, slamming into a bank of snow and absorbing the impact across her body. Making sure that her stomach wound hadn't opened up and spilled her organs everywhere, Ruby began to run, retracing the footsteps she had made in the snow. Hopefully the large amount of walking she had done in the past day would help disguise her tracks and let them blend into the surroundings. The document thumped against her shoulder as she ran, Ruby slowing down when she reached the forest and making sure that nothing had spilled out. As she walked back to camp, she took out a roll of steel silk and used part of it to further wrap the towel-encased folder, making sure it was waterproof before shoving it under a bank of snow at her campsite. The handcuffs took a while to remove, Ruby eventually just taking her scythe and slicing them to pieces. Ruby ate a bit of the preserved vegetables and jerky the faunus had given her, then set up another stand to make her own jerky, noting that she would probably have to hunt again sometime soon. It was already very late, most of night gone due to her excursion, so Ruby finished her meal and immediately went to sleep, wrapping her cloak around herself. Ruby woke up the next morning expecting to see faunus surrounding her campsite and demanding her return of the documents, but nothing happened, the air nice and peaceful. Ruby lay back down, still a little sleepy, and dozed off again. It was already past noon when she woke up again, yawning and stretching, clipping her cloak back into place. Taking the jerky down from the stand, she munched on the dried meat as she pulled the bundle of documents out from under the snow. Carefully spreading her cloak under herself, she sat down on it and set down the documents. Unwrapping the steel silk and the towels, she spread the sheets of paper out, beginning to read through them. The papers were police reports and evidence, along with some of Maya's own notes and conclusions. Ruby read through the reports, realizing that Maya had been gathering evidence and testimonies in all the assaults and thefts that had occurred since New Haven's founding. Names were circled and timestamps were underlined with pen and marker, each outlined thing written down on a map of the overall settlement. Rummaging around the pile, Ruby caught sight of a thick piece of paper, pulling it out and unfolding it. The paper flipped open to reveal a large tree of rectangular boxes, indicating a structure of command with a few spaces at the top and an increasing amount of spaces at the bottom. There were many blanks and dead ends, indicating faunus that witnesses had seen but were unable to identify. A notepad was filled with neat, structured thoughts, with plenty of strike throughs and lines drawn to connect ideas. Most of it was gibberish to Ruby, as she didn't know any of the names and places mentioned, but there were a lot of statements indicating that Maya was recently becoming frustrated and unable to make progress. Ruby wasn't even done with half of the folder by the time the sun had set, an entire afternoon spent reading and thinking about the contents of the documents. It was too dark to read now, so Ruby carefully rearranged the documents back into order, wrapping them into place with steel silk and then covering them with towels and another layer of steel silk. Carefully stashing the folder in another bank of snow, Ruby put her cloak back on and stood up, yawning and stretching. Setting up a campfire, she cooked the last bit of her frozen meat, eating a hot meal, and warmed some snow, drinking it. She wondered if she could ask Maya for some spices and tea, as she was getting a little bored of eating plain raw flesh and drinking stale water. The Beowulfs arrived some time later, crowding around Ruby and jumping on her. Ruby played them, wrestling and tussling, throwing trunks of trees into the air for them to catch. After Ruby had thrown them around sufficiently, the Beowulfs melted back into the forest, going off to do Beowulf things. Ruby dusted herself off, making a mental note to go hunting the next morning. The night was cool but still warmer than before, the weather shifting to early spring. However, there was still a lot of residual snow, and the temperatures weren't yet warm enough to melt it, so the snow formed a crusty layer on the top with softer ice underneath. Not wanting to further damage her clothing, Ruby took the aerial route, leaping through the trees as she retraced her path from the previous night. The moon was less bright tonight, a few clouds drifting over it and obscuring its light. Making sure to perfectly retrace her footsteps, Ruby made her way across the clearing to the previous indentations she had carved in the wall, looking around to make sure that there weren't any guards at the top. She didn't need her scythe as she climbed up the wooden structure, instead just slipping her fingers into the slices she had made and quickly climbing her way up, sometimes skipping a few handholds. At the top of the wall, Ruby looked around carefully, wondering if Maya had set up any traps for her. Seeing that the coast was clear, she did the same repelling trick, softly landing on the roof of Maya's house. "Just come in already," came a voice. "You do realize that I can hear you, right?" Ruby scrambled off of the house, jumping to the ground and going to the front door, knocking. The dirt street was deserted at this time of the night, all the other houses dark and quiet. Maya opened the door, motioning for her to come in. Her chest was covered with a black bulletproof vest, and she wore a dark blue long-sleeved enforcer jacket and matching dress pants. A black leather belt wrapped around her waist, 2 holstered pistols, a pouch, and a police radio attached to it. Her hair was hidden behind a blue peaked hat that was rimmed with black, completing the ensemble. "Well, come on in," Maya said impatiently as Ruby cautiously poked her head into the room. Ruby stepped through the doorway and spun around, facing Maya and putting a hand on her side. "I'm not going to arrest you, all right," Maya said. "I need those documents back, and I don't know where you've hidden them." Seeing that Ruby was still on the defensive, Maya unclipped her belt and set it onto the table with a clunk. "Better." Ruby nodded, moving her hand away from her weapon and straightening out her cloak. "What do you want for the documents?" Maya asked. "I can give you my promise not to turn you in, but I doubt you'd trust me." "An oath of eternal loyalty," Ruby quipped. Maya frowned, tapping her foot, unamused. "Didn't you say you weren't going to come back tonight?" she recalled. Ruby thought for a moment. "Well, I read through the documents, and if I'm not mistaken, you're trying to gather evidence to convict some people, right?" "You read through them," Maya exclaimed. "If you damaged anything." No, they're perfectly fine," Ruby assured her. "I was just wondering why you would be doing something like this." "What do you mean?" Maya said innocently. "I'm a police officer, this is my job." "But some of the writing says to keep the papers away from the sheriff, and you keep writing about corruption in the police department," Ruby pointed out. Maya sagged a little. "I guess I was a little too obvious," she admitted. "So?" Ruby prodded. Maya took a breath, letting it out. "There's been an unusually high amount of crimes in New Haven ever since its founding," she explained. "I only got here a few months ago, but I noticed that a lot of cases had been closed even though the perpetrators or stolen belongings hadn't been found." So you decided to investigate. Maya nodded. I started working in secret, gathering evidence and asking around about what had happened. A lot of people were willing to talk to me, and so I found out that the investigators had simply ignored all the evidence they had been given. At this point, I realized that the people who were committing crimes had connections to the police. And now you're going to find evidence, give it to people like Vincent, and arrest all of the bribed officers, right? Ruby concluded, growing excited. No, Maya said, shaking her head. It doesn't work like that. The police force is already pretty small, and if I had all the corrupt people leave, then we'd be left with nothing. Ruby deflated. Then what are you going to do? She asked. Maya debated with herself for a moment. Ah, fuck it, she sighed. I'll tell you everything, and you'll give me the documents back, alright? Only if you let me help you, Ruby said stubbornly. Why would you want to help? Maya asked, surprised. I want to prove that I can be a good person, and then they'll let me live here, with actual people, Ruby said. It's really boring living outside. You want to help us because you're bored? Maya said incredulously. And because I want to be a better person, Ruby reminded her. But you're not even allowed to be in here. Well, that hasn't stopped me, has it? And I can just sneak around during the night. I'll be stealthy, I promise. Maya thought for a second. Well, you are strong, and I could use you as backup, she decided. I can just give you something to hide your face, and then you're going to need a change of clothes. Great. Ruby beamed, beginning to strip. Wait, I haven't even told you what my plan is, Maya said, frowning. Ruby stopped. Oh, right. Since I can't really overturn the existing power structure, I'm going to focus on helping those people and then try to catch the perpetrators, Maya explained. We can follow them around and film them, then stop them from committing crimes. Sounds good, Ruby said. Is there anyone else who could help us? If there was anyone else, I wouldn't be accepting your help, Maya stated, staring at her. Harsh, Ruby complained, wincing. I'm still a little reluctant about having a murderer help me, you know, no matter how desperate I am. But I haven't seen you kill anyone yet. I don't know if the rumors are true or not, and you didn't kill me last night after you knocked me unconscious, so I'll believe in your good intentions for now. Maya paused for a second. Also, I really need those documents, and I have a feeling you're not going to stop bothering me unless you get to do something. Yup, Ruby agreed, smiling. When did everything start going so poorly? Maya muttered, taking off her bulletproof vest and setting her cap down onto the table. When you transferred here, Ruby suggested, watching her. Ha ha, she said, taking off her uniform, a black tank top underneath it. Ruby drooled a little as she watched her strip, quickly wiping the corner of her mouth. She wanted to stroke Maya's supple, firm body, fondle her breasts, bury her nose in that brilliant blue hair, so she sat on her hands, not willing to jeopardize the uneasy truce. Can we do anything tonight? Ruby asked, trying to distract herself. Maya rummaged through the closet, shivering a little, finding a white bathrobe and putting it on. She turned to Ruby, shaking her head as she undid her ponytail. My clothes are too long, so I'll get you some normal-sized ones tomorrow, she explained. Maybe I can also get you some perfume or odor-killing substance to disguise your human smell. Maya paused, leaning closer to Ruby and sniffing. That's odd, she said, a puzzled expression on her face. I can barely smell anything coming from you. It's like you don't even have a scent. You just smell, I don't know, alive. Don't ask me, Ruby said, shrugging. Giving one final sniff, Maya pulled away, a thoughtful expression on her face. Well, that's going to be useful. Okay, Ruby said, trying to finalize the agreement. So we agree that if I don't tell anyone about what you're doing, and I return your documents, you don't report me and I get to help you, right? Right, Maya responded, looking around for something. Damn it, she exclaimed. I'm out of firewood. I have a lot, I could bring you some, Ruby offered. Maya raised an eyebrow. You're going to carry it over the wall. Ruby nodded. I'm an Aura user, so it'll be easy for me. Are you an Aura user? She asked. Yeah, Maya said, realizing why she wanted to know. I guess I could go with you, she speculated. We could bring back a large amount of firewood that way. Ah, wouldn't people notice if you suddenly had a huge pile of firewood in your house? Ruby wondered. I mean, you guys aren't even allowed to go outside the walls, or you. It's fine, Maya said, dismissing her concerns. I'm the only one who lives here, and we could just store it in the basement. It gets really damn cold, so it'll be worth it. Do you want to change? Ruby asked, noticing her attire. It's pretty cold outside. Yeah, give me a second, Maya said, taking off her bathrobe and pulling off her dress pants. Ruby tried not to stare at her long legs, instead looking up at the ceiling. Let's go, Maya said a few seconds later. Ruby looked back down. Maya was wearing a parka, snow pants, and thick black gloves, clearly dressed for the cold. Aren't you faunas supposed to be cold resistant? Ruby asked, standing up. Not all of us are, and where I come from, it's sunny all year round, Maya explained, impatiently walking toward the door. And I hate the cold. Then why'd you come here? Ruby asked. Let's take the window, I want to get onto the roof. Maya walked towards the window, following Ruby as she pulled herself up. Because I heard about the so-called New Haven, and I wanted to help, she said, crawling onto the roof. I thought I could handle a little bit of cold weather. And besides, it's not snowy all the time. Ruby swung her scythe on a length of steel silk, anchoring it into the wall and beginning to climb up. Let me go first, Ruby said. I don't know if this will hold both of us. Maya nodded, waiting for Ruby to get to the top before beginning her climb up. She was a little unsteady at first, and Ruby was afraid she would slip, but Maya eventually made it to the top, flaring a little bit of blue aura and throwing herself over the parapet. Ruby pulled her scythe out of the wall, preparing to anchor it to the other side. Guard! Maya whispered furiously. Wah! Ruby managed to say, and then Maya pulled her over the edge and they started falling. Chapter 41, Infiltration PT-3. The fall was brief, the pair hitting the ground in less than 2 seconds. Unfortunately, Ruby had cleared away a lot of the snow beneath them with her constant walking and excursions to New Haven, resulting in a hard landing on the frozen ground. Since Maya had pulled her over the ledge, Ruby was underneath her, slamming into the ground face first with Maya on top of her. Ruby's aura protected her from most of the impact, including Maya's joints being slammed into her back, but her nose still broke, blood beginning to stream out. Ah! Ruby moaned, her brain rattled. Shish, Maya whispered furiously, putting a finger to her lips. She craned her neck around, looking at the top of the wall. The guard passed their previous position a few seconds later, oblivious to what had just occurred. The two lay like that for a few minutes, Maya on top of Ruby, making sure that the guard had left. We're in the clear, Maya said, rolling off of Ruby. Sorry about that. No problem, Ruby mumbled, sitting up and rubbing her head. She noticed the blood streaming down her chin, staining the steel silk wraps and the shreds of her skirt. Oh come on, she complained, frantically wiping the blood off and into the snow. Stop that, Maya said, turning the pink snow over. They'll notice the bloodstains on the snow. Ruby grabbed her nose and snapped it back into place, wincing at the cracking sound. She wiped the blood off with her cloak, hoping that its waterproofing would prevent the blood from staining it. Doesn't that hurt? Maya asked, as they started walking towards the forest. Ruby shook her head. Physical pain doesn't hurt much, she responded. They walked for a few minutes in a straight line, eventually reaching the edge of the forest. Ruby led the way as they walked toward her camp. You agreed to come with me pretty quickly, Ruby observed. Don't you want to stay home and rest? In that cold as hell house? No way, Maya said, shaking her head and stepping around a tree. You're not bringing me out here to kill me, or you. Ruby stumbled, surprised. Ah, no. Maya nodded to herself. Good, 'cause you wouldn't be able to. Ruby didn't want to argue with her, so she changed the topic. So I heard that rabbits were pretty social, Ruby began. But you seem to be living by yourself. I'm in the police force, Maya said, ducking under a low tree branch. So a lot of the faunas don't like me based on principle, and the rabbit faunas community doesn't accept me. Not surprising, considering the level of corruption in our department. But why would you live alone? Ruby asked curiously. Well, as a police officer I get the option to live in the police housing, Maya explained. But the neighborhood is empty because most of the police officers actually live in their own communities. Doesn't it get lonely? Maya shook her head. I'm used to it by now, she said. Might as well take a free house with peace and solitude than try to fit in where I don't belong. Ruby nodded, understanding. By the way, how's your stomach? Maya asked, noticing that Ruby had no trouble moving through the dense forest. It's already fine, Ruby said, realizing that the rag was still around her midsection. She took it off, placing the rag into her pouch, and pulled the torn edges of her dress slightly apart, showing the pale white scar. Maya's eyes widened. Wow, you heal fast. Sorry about stabbing you and sorry about the scar, she apologized. No, it's fine, Ruby assured her. I already have plenty of scars, so it fits right in. Maya took a moment to digest that statement. I see, she said softly, lapsing into silence. When they reached the campsite, the Beowulfs immediately ran into the clearing, growling at the newcomer. Maya leapt back, patting her pants and realizing she had forgotten to take her weapons. Red, do something, Maya yelled. Ruby ran forward and hugged them, putting them into headlocks and physically dragging them backwards. Shish, it's okay, Ruby whispered to the Beowulfs. The scary lady won't hurt you. What do you mean, scary lady? Maya said, frowning. I'm not the one raising pet Beowulfs. The Beowulfs, reassured by Ruby but still suspicious of Maya, retreated into the woods, patrolling the perimeter. You know, the Grim don't exactly make trust you more, Maya said, looking around the camp. They're really good watchdogs, Ruby offered. Maya made a sound of disbelief, pointing at the piles of wood Ruby had scattered around the clearing. What the hell? There were nearly a dozen giant stacks of firewood, all neatly corded and piled up. I had a lot of time, Ruby said, shrugging. Striding forward, she started dragging down cords of wood, tying together a large bundle of a few 100 pounds and strapping it to her back. Maya also put an impressive amount on her back, borrowing some steel silk from Ruby and strapping it on. Bring as much as you can carry, Maya said. We can bring it up the wall in multiple trips. Ruby nodded, adding a bit more firewood to her pile. She flared her aura, teetering a little as the gigantic stack of wood on her back almost unbalanced her. Maya whistled. Damn, you're strong, she said, looking appreciatively at Ruby. I retract my earlier statement. Ruby grinned, beginning to jog towards the wall. She was flaring her aura, and she figured that she might as well take full advantage of it. The tree branches above her splintered as she ran through the woods, exhilarated. She hadn't been able to run like this in quite a while and she was enjoying it. She broke through the tree line a few minutes later, Maya right behind her. Crouching down, she ran across the snow, retracing her earlier path. Luckily, the moon was still cloudy, so the two remained undetected as they sprinted across the clearing. They stopped underneath the wall, panting, and dropped their loads to the ground, looking up and making sure no guards were nearby. I'll go first, Ruby said, taking a fraction of the wood. Wait, Maya said, stepping forward and examining the handholds. I think you need to make these a little deeper and wider so you won't just slip when you try to hold on. Ruby nodded, pulling out her scythe and unfolding it. Nice weapon, Maya said enviously. All I have are some stupid aura-powered guns. You could make your own weapon when you have the time, Ruby proposed. Or you could just buy one. I heard that there's some really well-made custom weapons on the market. Nah, Maya said, stuffing her hands into her pockets. I don't have enough money, and even if I did, there are only a few specific weapons allowed for police officers. That sucks, Ruby said sympathetically, stabbing her scythe into the wall and beginning to climb. Give me a few minutes, she called down. Be quiet, Maya hissed. Ruby mouthed an oops and turned back, continuing to climb. A few minutes later, she reached the top of the wall, then jumped back down, flaring her aura and hitting the ground with a thumb, landing with her knees bent and a hand on the ground. Let's do this quickly, Maya said, grabbing some firewood and tying it to her back. It's getting late, and I still have a job to do tomorrow. And I need to get back to camp, in case Vincent tries to contact me again, Ruby said, shouldering some wood. Maya raised an eyebrow at her statement but didn't question it, instead motioning for Ruby to start climbing. The handholds creaked a little but didn't break as Ruby climbed up the wall, setting the wood down on the walkway, breathing a little harder. "Ah shoot," Ruby said, smacking her forehead. "I need to make handholds on the other side." Maya looked down at her house. "Ah," she said. "Here, just let me go down first, and you can just wrap the wood and toss it down." "Good idea," Ruby said, pulling out her spool of steel silk. The spool still had half of it left, Ruby having carefully recycled the steel silk she used. She sliced strips off with her scythe and tied together the 2 stacks of wood they brought up, throwing it to the ground at the side of Maya's house. "Be careful," Maya warned. "I don't want a hole in my roof." "I will," Ruby promised, anchoring her scythe into the wall and tying a length of steel silk to it. Maya grabbed onto the tough fabric and jumped down, sliding down the wall and using her gloves to protect her hands from the friction. She hit the ground rolling, standing up and giving a thumbs up sign before beginning to drag the firewood into her house. Ruby jumped off of the wall, repeating the process a couple of times and throwing the firewood into Maya's yard. After she was done, she rappelled down the wall and joined Maya in lugging the firewood into the house. The light was on inside, so Ruby finally got her first good look at the inside of the house. The entrance room that also served as the living room was devoid of decoration, only containing a sofa, a work desk, and a wooden chair, paper and pencils scattered on the surface of the desk. The small sofa faced the fireplace, a thin rug between the two. The floor was wooden and bare, transitioning to a tiled floor in the kitchen area. A counter separated the kitchen and the living room. The kitchen was filled with cabinets and had a single stove, a faucet in the sink. A window covered with wooden shutters lay above the granite countertop, Ruby remembering it as the place she had entered the house from. To the left of the living room was hallway that led the bedrooms and bathrooms, ending in a small closet. Maya didn't bother taking her police boots off as they carried the wood down the hallway, walking into an open door that led the basement. A small light was on halfway down the stairs, and a portable dust-powered lantern sat in the middle of the low basement, giving off a soft yellow glow. A few large tubes were piled in the corner of the room, some filled with yellow dust. "You guys have plumbing?" Ruby asked, surprised after seeing the faucet in the bathroom. "Yeah, it was one of the first things to be requested," Maya said, setting down her load and arching her back. "So how long will this wood last you?" Ruby asked as they walked back up the stairs. "I can always bring you more if you need any." "I'll be fine," Maya said. "I get home late and I get up early, so I mostly just burn some wood when I'm doing some late night work or if it's really cold." "Do you do any cooking?" Ruby asked, having noticed her stove. Maya shook her head, lifting up another pile of wood. "Very little. There are a lot of restaurants in the center of town, so I just buy some food." Ruby carried another load, following her down the stairs again. "You guys use money?" Maya sighed a little, exasperated at the volume of questions. "Yes, we just use lien, but since we're not connected to the global banking system we just use single currencies, no master lien." "So how do you get paid? Do you really have to ask so many questions?" Ruby paused for a second. "Well, since I'm going to be pretending that I'm a faunus, I should learn how you live, right?" "That's a good point," Maya conceded. "But we should finish lugging this firewood around first and then we can talk." Ruby agreed and the two worked in silence for the next few minutes, carefully bringing the firewood down and making sure that they didn't damage the house. After some firewood was left upstairs and the rest stacked in the basement, Ruby took the steel silk bindings back and rewrapped them into her spool. Maya looked at the watch on her wrist, noticing the time. "Ah crap," she muttered. "I have to go to work in an hour. And I need to get back to camp," Ruby said. "Screw it," Maya suddenly said, plopping down on the sofa. "Let's talk. 1 hour of sleep won't help me that much anyways." "All right," Ruby agreed, sitting down on the chair at the table. "What do you want to talk about?" "I can finish answering your question first," Maya said, leaning back in the sofa. "Ah, it's cold," she said, shivering. "Let me start a fire." She grabbed a few logs, shoving them in a fistful of kindling into the fireplace. Walking to the kitchen, she opened up a drawer and pulled out a tinderbox. We get a little money just by living here, Maya said, lighting the fire. She sat back in the couch, sighing in satisfaction as heat started radiating from the fireplace. Those who work earn more money, depending on their job. If I pretend to be a faunus, what are my chances of being discovered? Ruby asked. I don't want to ruin my chances of being allowed to live here. Well, I think you have a good probability of remaining undetected, Maya said thoughtfully. All you have to do is claim that you were living alone for a while. We have a couple of loners like that, so you shouldn't draw too much suspicion. Won't people recognize that I don't belong here? Maya shook her head. There are over 1,000 people in New Haven, so as a loner it could be possible that you just haven't gone out and met anyone else before. Also, the only checks we do are when the faunus arrive at the main gate, and then we check to see if their ID matches up. Since you sneaked in, people will just assume that you're supposed to be here. And what about my smell? Ruby worried. Maya took a sniff again, confirming her thoughts. I can get you some sort of perfume and mask the tiny bit of smell you have, she said. Then you can just say that you're a snake faunus. Snake faunus don't really have any smell, and they don't have ears or anything like that to distinguish them. They do have scales on their upper chest areas though, Ruby pointed out. I'm not going to ask how you know that, Maya said, smirking. But unless you're going to be showing your chest to everyone, I don't think anyone will check. Ruby clapped her hands together. Oh, that reminds me, I need to find a way to contact Mark, she exclaimed. Mark? Maya asked. Didn't you mention something about him when you tried to break into my house the other night? Ah, I didn't mean to break into your house, sorry, Ruby apologized. And I saw Mark's scales when he showed them to me. Are you two a couple? Maya asked bluntly. No, Ruby exclaimed, blushing a bit. Long story, we're friends and I sort of saved his life. Sounds interesting, Maya said. You're going to have to tell me that story one day. When we're less busy, Ruby promised. So is there any way I could contact Mark? She asked hopefully. I could check the records for you and tell you where he might living, Maya said. But the records aren't updated after the initial entrance, so your best bet would be to go around the busiest parts of town and see if you bump into him. Okay, Ruby said, nodding. So what about my hair and clothing? Maya waved her hand. I can probably get you some clothing from the Lost and Found, or I can just go buy some. Better yet, I could give you some money and you could go buy some for yourself. She looked at Ruby's hair, humming. We can dye your hair, she offered. Can't you get a wig or something? Ruby asked nervously, touching her hair. Maya shook her head. No wigs, she said. Who would make wigs in this small town? And your hair is too distinctive, so it's got to go. She stared at Ruby's face, analyzing it. Eyes too. Those eyes are way too recognizable. I can get you some contacts. Ack, Ruby cringed. I'm beginning to regret my decision. Maya wasn't stopping, however. Do you want glasses too? I can get you some. No, I'm good, Ruby said, a little frightened. I think a hair change and contacts should be enough, right? Maya let out a breath, a little disappointed. Yes, I guess so, she conceded. Does anyone know what you look like? Ruby thought for a moment. The council and Vincent do, and so do the guards. That's fine, Maya said, a relieved expression on her face. The council usually just stays at the village hall. They're administrators, so they don't venture out that often, except to go back to their faunus communities to sleep. The guards also have their own separate barracks, so between your disguise and their different living areas, you hopefully won't get recognized. Anything else I need to do? Ruby asked. Construct a believable backstory, Maya responded. Or just say that you don't want to talk about it. I've had tons of practice doing that, Ruby muttered. Maya raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Should I just say that I live with you? Yeah, just say that you recently moved in with me, Maya answered. Clothes, hair, eyes, she counted off on her fingers. We can discuss how we organize our schedule tomorrow. The sky was brightening, the sun nearly peaking above the horizon. Great, Ruby said. I need to get back now, in case someone comes looking for me. See ya, Maya said, standing up and beginning to change out of her parka and snow pants. Come back tomorrow afternoon, I'll come home early. Ruby agreed and said her goodbyes, waving and exiting through the front door and jumping to the roof. Rappelling up the wall again, she heading back towards camp, hoping she could get there before sunrise. Chapter 42, Disguised. The sun had just risen above the horizon as Ruby reached her camp in record time, having thrown herself from tree to tree without stopping and bypassing all of the snow. Checking to make sure that the documents were still there, she breathed a sigh of relief and sat down, thinking. Her stomach was growling a little, she was out of meat and needed to go hunting again. However, she was tired from the long night and needed some rest. Spreading her cloak out onto the ground, she lay down and took a nap. The sun was already high in the sky when she woke up a few hours later. It was nearly noon, and Ruby remembered how Maya had told her to come back in the afternoon. Sitting up and stretching, she peeked out of the tent and looked around, seeing no sign of any messengers or visitors having come by when she was asleep. Ruby grabbed the tarp from inside her tent, reusing the same tarp for every hunt. Picking a random direction deeper into the forest, she started running. A few minutes later, she stopped, looking around her. Choosing a tall nearby tree, she ran up the trunk and swung herself up on a branch, pulling herself upwards until she reached the top of the tree. The day was clear, with no sign of fog or snow. Ruby could see miles in every direction, the bare trees interlaced with groves of evergreens. She crouched there silently, waiting, thinking. Could she trust Maya? Probably, considering her dedication to do good being shown by her documents and living location. She would have to talk with Vincent the next time he came around and find a way to stop the morning visits. If she was going to help Maya and pretend to be a faunus, she couldn't be rushing back every time the sun came up. The tablet. Ruby suddenly thought, mentally smacking herself. I could just have Vincent message me whenever something comes up, instead of having him send a messenger. Ruby took out her tablet, making sure that it still worked, and took the opportunity to check how far she was from her campsite. She was a few miles away, in a different location from her previous hunts, so she hoped that the deer would still be around here. I wonder if I could bait them, Ruby idly thought, fiddling with her scythe as she looked around. Maybe Maya can give me some vegetables or something. An hour later, Ruby caught sight of a black speck moving a few miles away. Unable to tell if it was an animal or a grim at this distance, Ruby tensed her muscles and leapt to the next treetop, slamming her side into the wood to stabilize herself as she landed on the bark. Carefully moving in this way, unwilling to take a fall from such heights, Ruby slowly moved towards the black speck, the creature growing larger in her vision. She was unsure whether she was grateful or disappointed when she saw that it was just a normal black bear foraging for food in the snowy landscape. She hadn't seen many of these before, but she supposed that the lack of grim in the area had allowed other animals to start coming out. Ruby reached the tree closest to the bear, climbing down a bit into a crevice between two branches and setting down her scythe, slowly and silently sliding her blade into the wood. The bear didn't notice as Ruby aimed carefully, steadying herself with the anchored scythe. Her shot was dead on, the bear's skull and brains exploding into fragments and a bloody red smear. Its body instantly dropped to the ground, twitching a little as the sound of the gunshot rang through the forest, startling some nearby birds. Folding her scythe and dropping from branch to branch, Ruby made her way down the tree, hitting the ground and walking towards the corpse. The body still warm, Ruby slurped some blood from its gaping neck wound and took a few bites to quell her hunger before she did anything else. The texture was thick and the meat tasted gamey, but Ruby made short work of the tough muscle as she ripped through it with her sharp teeth. Crunching on the neck bones, she took out her tarp and set it onto the ground, flipping the body onto it and wrapping it up. She bound the tarp to her back with strips of steel silk, making sure it was tightly secured before beginning the run back to camp. By the time she got back, it was nearly 3 hours past noon, Ruby having spent a lot of time stalking and hunting her prey. Extending her scythe again, she carefully made a cut down the bear's chest and stomach. Sticking her hand underneath the hot skin but above the muscle, she separated the two layers, delicately peeling back the hide. As she worked, she wondered if it would be offensive if she wore the pelt around bear faunus. Shouldn't risk it, she decided, amused by the thought. A few minutes later, the hide was stripped off, mostly in one piece. Ruby tied the skin between two tree limbs, letting it dry in the air as she cleaned her hands and forearms. The snow didn't do too good of a job, so she decided to ignore the bloodstains for now and chop up the meat instead. The intestines were thrown away carefully, Ruby avoiding leakage, not willing to deal with the foul contents. She ate the kidneys and part of the liver, wrapping the rest of the organs up in a small piece of tarp and shoving it under the snow. The rest of the meat was sliced at the joints and bundled up into the larger piece of the tarp, Ruby packing the inside with snow and storing it next to the organs. Job finished, Ruby straightened her clothes and pulled out her tablet, checking the time. It was already past 4, and the sun was beginning to set. Remembering her promise, Ruby pulled out the wrapped-up folder hidden underneath the snow and tied it to her shoulder. She set off toward New Haven, scrubbing snow on her face as she tried to get the dried blood off. The snow didn't help much, the sharp flecks of ice only pricking her skin, so she gave up, instead raising her hood and pulling the bottom half closed, wrapping her cloak around herself. Arriving in the clearing, she walked towards the river, waving to any guard tower she passed and hoping they had been habituated to her presence. None of them shouted or raised an alarm, so Ruby took that as a sign that the blood smearing her face and arms hadn't been noticed. The river was covered in a thick layer of ice, a few blurry shapes swimming beneath the surface. Ruby looked curiously at the fish underneath, remembering the lack of variety in her diet. Rolling up what was left of her sleeves, she flared her aura and smashed her fist through the ice. Chunks flew everywhere, the surface of the river cracking, flows of ice tilting upwards. The layer of ice was thicker than Ruby had expected, her knuckles fracturing as she punched through the surface. The fish were already gone by the time Ruby's hand entered the water, startled away by the impact. Sighing, Ruby popped her dislocated finger joints back into place and instead washed her face and arms, getting the blood off. The water was freezing cold, but Ruby didn't mind, taking a few gulps and rinsing out her mouth, cleaning the blood off of her teeth. Her bloody knuckles had already begun to scab over as she walked toward the lacerations she had made in the wall, trying to look nonchalant as she passed the guard towers. The sun was already low on the horizon, Ruby hoping that she wasn't late. She scampered up the wall quickly, her motions more like launching herself upwards instead of climbing, skipping handholds as she reached the top of the wall. In a practiced motion, she had her scythe anchored and steel silk wrapped the handle in a matter of seconds, rappelling down the wall. She landed on the roof of Maya's house, her boots announcing her presence as she pulled the scythe out of the wall and caught it. Collapsing her weapon and jumping off of the roof, she walked to the front door and knocked on the wood. "Come in," came Maya's voice. Ruby turned the handle and pushed the door open, stepping inside. Maya was lying on the couch, a blanket tucked around her. The fireplace was lit, a sense of warmth radiating throughout the room. "Shut the door," Maya sleepily muttered. "You're letting the heat out." Closing the door softly, Ruby walked into the room and sat down on the chair, turning herself around and straddling it as she watched Maya. Her brilliant blue hair streamed down the blankets, her eyes closed and face peaceful as she fell asleep again. Moving closer, Ruby sat down on the rug in front of the fireplace and watched her sleep. She was content as she bathed in the glow of the fire, watching Maya's chest rise up and down with each breath. A few minutes later, Maya woke herself up, her blinking eyes focusing on Ruby. "That's a little creepy, Red," Maya said, yawning and sitting up. Ruby smiled, baring her sharp white teeth as she lounged in front of the fireplace, her body feeling hot and luxurious. "I like watching you sleep," Ruby purred. "Okay then," Maya responded, keeping her blankets wrapped around herself and getting up. "I'm going to make some tea." Ruby blinked, some sense returning to her. "That reminds me," she said, getting up. "Could I have some tea leaves? I've only been drinking water for the past few weeks and it's getting boring." "Okay, water and blood," Ruby mentally amended. "But she doesn't need to know that." Maya rummaged around the cupboard, looking for the tin of dried leaves. "If I can find it," she said, pulling out packages of unused spices and setting them down in her search. "I don't usually eat at home, so I don't remember if I bought any." "So, no milk. How would I store milk without a refrigerator?" The sky was beginning to dim as the sun started disappearing below the horizon. Ruby grabbed the lantern on the counter and flicked the switch, a yellow glow filling the room. Thanks, Maya said, flipping open another cupboard. Ah, here it is. Maya set the small tin of tea leaves onto the counter, then loaded the stove with wood. I usually stay at the office and work late, Maya explained as she lit the fire. I just come home to sleep. Sorry about being late, Ruby apologized. Nah, I needed some rest anyways, Maya assured her, turning on the faucet and filling a small pot with water. She set the pot on the stove and walked toward her desk, Ruby following her. The water's going to take a while to boil, so I can show you some things I got first, Maya said, beginning to open up her messenger bag. Wait, Ruby said. I have your documents. She took it off of her shoulder, unwrapping it and handing it to Maya. Maya quickly flipped through the contents, checking to make sure nothing was damaged or missing. Thank you, Maya said, looking up and smiling at her. Thanks for keeping your promise. No problem, Ruby assured her, Maya's smile making her heart thump. Maya set the documents down on the table and went back to the bag, pulling out a small clear case and setting a bottle down next to it. Contact lenses, she said, pointing at the case. The color of the contacts will completely disguise your light eye color. Ah, what color is it? Ruby asked nervously. Blue, Maya said, grinning. It's the best color, after all. Of course, Ruby said, chuckling. Unscrewing the lid of the case, Maya carefully took out 2 contact lenses, showing Ruby how to put them on. Your eyes will water at first, but you'll get used to them pretty quickly, Maya said, holding up a bottle. When you're done using them, just switch out the solution in the case with the stuff in this bottle and drop the contacts back in. Where do you even get this stuff? Ruby asked, popping a lens into each eye. Her eyes started watering immediately, Ruby blinking rapidly as liquid dripped out of her eyes. Just some special stuff we can order, Maya said dismissively. I'm not allowed to tell you much more, but sometimes we can get the government to send in airdrops of supplies. Besides, these are pretty popular amongst the younger crowd. As Ruby adjusted to the contact lenses, Maya pulled out another canister with a brand label that Ruby didn't recognize. Temporary hair dye, Maya said, shaking the can. This way you can keep your hair color since you like it so much, but now you'll also be able to disguise yourself. How easily does it come off? Maya popped the top off. It's just a light shade of black, to hide the red parts of your hair. You'll be able to get it off by thoroughly rinsing your hair. Alright, Ruby said. Can I spray it on? Sure, Maya said, shrugging. It's also a hair gel, so we can rearrange your hair while we're at it. Ruby walked towards the bathroom, Maya bringing her messenger bag along. Nah, use my bedroom, Maya said. There's a full-length mirror in there. Maya's bedroom was also sparsely furnished, containing only a simple bed with a large mirror on the closet door. Ruby faced the mirror, looking at her reflection. Although she knew what her clothing looked like, she hadn't seen herself from this point of view in quite a while. Didn't know I looked that bad, Ruby said, wincing upon seeing her appearance. Her raggedy dress was literally only scraps of cloth now, the only thing keeping her decent being the steel silk wrap around her chest. She washed her clothes in boiled snow once every few days, but the bloodstains still remained, some barely visible on the black sections of the fabric. Her cloak was also a little tattered, having seen too much use recently. Her hair had gotten longer over the past few months, a little straighter now and not as messy as before. It's just the clothing, Maya reassured her. Don't worry, I got you some clothes, and then you can go buy some yourself. I only have a little bit of money, Ruby realized, the master lean in her pouch unusable. Just borrow some of mine, Maya said. It's not like I use it for much anyways. Pay me back whenever you can. Thanks, Ruby said, feeling a little bad. Taking the bottle from Maya's hands, she gently sprayed her hair, resisting the urge to throw the canister away as she blackened the red strands. Remembering how her hair used to look, Ruby made it a little messy on purpose, trying to recreate what it used to look like. Not bad, Maya said, impressed by the overall effect. Now we just need to add the clothes. She took out a black long-sleeved sweater and a pair of jeans, along with plain white panties and a seamless white bra. "Try these on," she said, offering Ruby the clothes. "I forgot to ask what size you were, so I just eyeballed it." Maya turned away as Ruby unwrapped the steel silk from her chest, unclipping her cloak and carefully taking off the remnants of her skirt and underclothes, wrapping them in the red fabric. Her boots and belt were placed on top of the pile. She slipped the underclothes on, then pulled the sweater over her head, sliding her arms through the sleeves. The jeans fit loosely, a little long, but Ruby just rolled the bottom of the jeans up. "And now even I wouldn't be able to recognize you," Maya said happily. "This is pretty fun." Ruby looked at herself in the mirror. Her silver eyes combined with the blue contacts made a sort of icy blue, a little startling on her pale face. Her hair was pure black and back to its original messy state, contrasting with her white skin. The sweater's collar went up to her neck, the long sleeves covering any scars or injuries Ruby had on her body. The jeans rounded out her overall appearance, the outfit giving her a calmer, more normal air. "Yeah, you definitely look less crazy," Maya confirmed, nodding. "It helps when you aren't half naked and covered in blood." Ruby blushed a bit. "Can I still wear my boots?" "Nope," Maya said, shaking her head. "Your looks right now don't exactly go with giant red and black combat boots." She pulled out a more sensible pair of flat-soled black boots that went halfway up her calves. "Try them on," she offered. "See if they fit." Ruby put them on, zipping them up in the back. "They're good," she said, experimentally walking around. Her new clothing was a little uncomfortable. Ruby used to the freedom that her previous outfit, or lack thereof, had given her, the sweater a little scratchy and the jeans rubbing against her skin. "Last thing," Maya said, pulling out a large canister. "This is a scent eliminator. Just spray this over your clothes and skin. I'm not sure if you'll need it, considering how small your scent is, but it's a good precaution." Ruby nodded, spraying herself and spraying her clothes. "Anything else?" she asked, grabbing the bundle of her previous clothes. "No," Maya said, leading the way back to the living room. "Get used to what you're wearing, and see if you can move around in that clothing. We'll just discuss plans for now." Maya sat back down onto the sofa, shivering a little as she covered herself up again with the blanket. Ruby sat down beside her, enjoying the fireplace. "All right, so, first things first," Maya said, leaning back and closing her eyes. "Can you get here every day during the afternoon? I didn't think you were doing anything, but I just wanted to make sure." "I can come around noon, when I'm sure that Vincent won't be trying to find me," Ruby said. "And I'm going to talk to Vincent and see if I can somehow just have him message me on my tablet instead of sending a messenger." "You have a tablet?" Maya said incredulously, opening her eyes. "You should have said so earlier." Maya pulled her messenger bag back to her, taking out a tablet. Ruby traded messaging addresses with her, sending a test message. "Hey, it worked," Ruby said, a little surprised as she remembered that the town wasn't connected to the global communications system. "We have a local network in New Haven," Maya said. "It lets everyone communicate much more easily, and the police force also needs it to coordinate." "That's so cool," Ruby said. "Do you know how far it goes?" "The range is pretty huge," Maya said, "and I think it depends on how far your tablet can broadcast and receive, so you might be able to receive messages from Vincent." "Awesome. So anyways, I'll message you if anything comes up, but otherwise the schedule is for you to get here sometime around 2 p.m., because that's when my shift ends. Usually I stay in the office afterwards to do some work, but I can just bring the stuff home and work on it from here. We haven't been that busy recently, anyways, not with the police force ignoring a lot of the crimes that have been going on." "I might be going on a hunting trip with Vincent," Ruby said. "I'll message you if I can't make it on time." "Alright, that sounds good. Since you're already all dressed up, we might as well go out tonight," Maya said, yawning. "But let me take a nap first." "What about dinner?" Ruby asked, her stomach a little growly. "We'll eat in town," Maya mumbled. "Now let me sleep. Go steep the tea, before the water cools down." Ruby dutifully walked to the kitchen, putting a few pinches of leaves into the boiling pot of water and covering the pot with a lid. When she got back to the living room, Maya was spread out on the couch again, sound asleep, so Ruby just resumed her position on the rug, waiting for her to wake up.